I think, no?
But they know who they are. Why do they need to listen to the translation of the introduction?
Yeah, maybe we could say something out of or something like that. So طيب بستنى إشارتك جويس. اوكي جاهزين؟ اوكي. مرحبا.
Hello, welcome to you. We are starting the third session. It's going to be a virtual session. We have three speakers with us that we welcome, and it's going to be an enjoyable session. The topics that will be discussed are important legally and politically, and in a criticism point of view as well. And we will start with Dr. Raif Zreik. Dr. Zreik is well known. Might have listened to many of his interventions in Muwatin's previous conferences. Dr. Raed is a scholar of jurisprudence from Harvard University. His research interests about so his list is about the challenge of anti-Semitism. So the floor is yours, Dr. Raed. Good evening, all. Thank you, Muwatin, and thank you, Birzeit University, for this for inviting me and for this important topic of the title for this conference. Although the feeling is increasing not only to Palestinians only, but also in particular for Palestinians, but in general, many people still seek and look for the update to get the freedoms because there are spaces that are shrinking. Spaces of political work, and this is for political and reasons, the manipulation, monopolization of the press, and the ability of a limited number of people to be able to govern and control in what can be said politically. I've selected and in the new definition, and I here confirm the word definition of anti-Semitism that was adopted by what's called IHRA, the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance. It is a body that emanated from a resolution that was basically from the UN to form a relevant committee. It started in Stockholm and it remained for 10 years in debate, and then it approved this definition by 2016. And since then, and I've noted since then up to now, this definition, I've been following up on it, and I've engaged with others, and that this will be, and I agreed with others that this will limit the political work of Palestinians, this definition. And regretfully, the days have proved that this definition has become a knife that stabs the Palestinian political action in Palestine or elsewhere, and it's a knife that stabbing the consolidating forces with Palestinian people. And a part of this, I would like to explain the dangers before even going into the depth of the definition. There's a feeling that is unjustified by not having a focused, systemized, a coordinated campaign on the Palestinian level, international level in this field. This definition that was adopted by the IHR, it has it's ambiguous, or in the description of this definition, it's not complying legally. And what's called soft law, it's the soft law, the law that when there's no need that it should be passed in a parliament. Therefore, it does not comply to constitutional reviews, and that its articles should be in line with the Constitution. Therefore, there is this retreat by many parliamentarians or politicians or workers in this field to deal with it as a law, because it's a soft law that it will not have any impact on the real life, and it's just a symbolic declaration. But even if this declaration was so soft, yet it's creating a very harsh reality. And as we've noted, that since the approval and adoption of this definition, things are going into a different path day by day. Meaning that the parliament, for instance, the German parliament has taken a decision that in reality defines even worse than this. For instance, the German parliament considered the BDS as an anti-Semitic movement. France, the situation is worse. The parliament have passed a decision that anti-Zionism is same as anti-Semitism. In the USA, there are many universities that have adopted IRA. The Minister of Culture and the American Minister of Culture has adopted this definition as well. The State Department has adopted it and has declared a while ago that according to this, as a consequence to this definition, that it's considered that Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International are considered as anti-Semitism organizations, in addition to tens and if not hundreds of events, conferences, activities that show consolidation with Palestinian people that are cancelled because in the pledge allege that they are anti-Semitism. Also, some scholars have been persecuted in this regard, and this is where it's important to refer to. And some might have been dismissed from the jobs, but even if they weren't, a professor at the university wasn't dismissed for this accusation. It's about what is the climate that is promoted in most of the universities around the world, mainly in the US, France, UK, and Germany. These are the Western countries, and the climate that is growing and increasing is that stay away from anti-Semitism. No one should come closer to any problematic issues to them. This means this is self-censorship. This means that there's intimidation is being hovering to all who is thinking of supporting Palestinian people. So it's a new agenda, a new political agenda is coming up that seeks to keep everyone away from the agenda of Palestine. And one of the main goals for for this new new Semitism or anti-Semitism definition. And I would say that Palestine and some ethical achievements that the case of Palestine had made, it was because due to the BDS activity, but something important and major that was focused on this movement is that every time there was a talk about occupation, about displacement, of confiscation, killing, or any Palestinian human rights, the discussion would turn right away from being the focus on Palestine to be about anti-Semitism. So the discussion, instead of the focus on Palestinian human rights, it would be like, is it in the first place, is it okay to tackle such issues, whether the right of return and the end of occupation and any other things? So these issues, were they legitimate to be discussed, because discussing such topics could be considered as anti-Semitic. Therefore, the objective then is to suffocate any potential to discuss the Palestinian case, and to mobilize those who are supporting it, and to set it in a continuous setting and as a self-defense rather than to be on the attack or the accusation against the Israeli practices. So a Palestinian would find himself that always in a defensive position to and prove him that would permit him to open the floor for discussion. Floor for discussion would always be locked until a commission or a group, a European group that would allow that person or that thing to go into discussion after they make sure that it's not contaminated with this disease of anti-Semitism. No doubt, this this obstructs the Palestinian political movement, and Israel for sure systematically and strategically tries to outreach to all universities, all committees, all institutions, one by one, state by state. And available information that we have is that Israel is now seeks to take an unprecedented step, which is to approach the UN Security Council to issue a declaration that would adopt the IRA for Semitism. This is very grave, and I've heard some Palestinians, friends, close friends, and scholars and thinkers think that whatever the UN decides, we don't care. Well, actually, the UN sent resolutions 242 and others, and we don't care. But I think this is a wrong approach. UN resolutions and what is called the international legitimacy and on certain topics in itself will never form any guarantee to any people to do any to have any achievement. Nothing would work if people don't consolidate with you. However, and on the other hand, if morally and physically there was this consolidation, this might lead to accomplishments. Till this day, we're still weak in front of Israel compared to Israel on the military side, politically, and so on. But we had a moral support that supported us. Passing a resolution by the UN is a moral strike against Palestinian people. And it is a moral strike to all associations that support the Palestinian case and its legitimate rights. And like Human Rights Watch, Oxfam, and Amnesty International, these three organizations, the State Department, the U.S. State Department had proposed that these should be labeled as anti-Semitism, Semitic organizations. So this is a battle that we need to fight, and that's why I'm from those people who say we cannot turn our back to such a topic because this will touch each of us. In Germany now, there's no way to conduct any forum, any lecture, even in the U.S. The cases where in instances where there was a presentation of allegations against the programs or lectures, you would not believe how much. If, for instance, a senator have said that just using the word of the word Palestine in description, like describing from the sea to the river, is anti-Semitic, or the apartheid wall is anti-Semitic, or the lighting of candles in the Gaza during Gaza aggression. This is anti-Semitic. Yazan Khalili, because he had worked in a Sakakini institution and in Sakakini. So this is absurd. So a Palestinian now cannot open her mouth, or else they'll be labeled by anti-Semitic. Some and two additional words that I like to say about the definition itself and why this definition is really dangerous. The definition itself in IRA is it has a short definition and then examples. The definition itself we might agree on. We as Palestinians and as Democrats and as ethical people, we're against uh, attacking any is a Jew in the world or that would or to harm anyone. But so definition it and about this definition, it's not the definition itself that is problematic. It's the examples that are embedded with this definition. Um, um, and here are some examples. One of the examples, for instance, I will just give two examples. To criticize Israel that exceeds the criticism of if the same person criticizes Israel in an unbalanced way as he criticizes other nations that practice the same crimes or same discriminatory policies. This he would be labeled as anti-Semitic. So Israel should be seen as other and treated as other nations. So this potentially will make that anyone who would dare to criticize Israel to be accused as anti-Semitic. And the basic thing that I believe in, and that's the more difficult example, which is dangerous not only to Palestine but on the whole human rights uh, metrics. It's that whoever considers Israel as a discriminatory project or negates the Jewish people to determine their destiny means he is anti-Semitic. So, and if we don't want to acknowledge the right of Jews in self-determination, well, this does not necessarily mean the right of a state, of having a state. So is it as if you don't, is it too much for them to have their own autonomy as Israelis? So the definition does not define what is meant by autonomy. And actually, the more popular definition is the right to having a state, to control its borders, and the sovereignty in this state. And with all this, there's the right of the state to control the immigration laws. Like who are the people who have the right to live within the borders of the state? So no one can impose on a state to that. So this is part of the sovereignty that a state would decide who its people are. And if we consider the right of autonomy and self-determination, this means clearly that the right of Israel not to make any demographic change, that meaning that the return of refugees, regardless of their number, should not change. What does this mean? This means that demanding the right of return is and in itself is an anti-Semitic position. What does this mean? This means that Israel has the right to make a demographic change. This is in a diplomatic language, and in a harsher language means that Israel has the right to expel Palestinians from their own land. And then if Palestinians demand that they go back to their own land, they would be counted as anti-Semitic. We have a document that claims that it's the document or that it forms part of the human rights system, which stipulates that Israel has the right to do ethnic cleansing crime. This is not only a catastrophe to Palestinians, It's a catastrophe to all, the whole human rights system. So this is a model, one model, and I've here put a question mark among many other question marks that raise many questions and that are considered as an obstacle, and that and that transforms Palestinians from being in a accused person to someone who wants to defend him or herself in order to be able to talk. And with this, I finish, and I think it's 20 minutes. Thank you.
Let me open the discussion because I know that you have to leave. Let's take questions. This is an opportunity to have Dr. Raif with us. So if anybody has any questions, because he needs to leave. Any questions? Please post on the chat.
Should I put it in the chat or say? Okay, I can say. So thank you for that really interesting talk. I think the danger that you the danger of that you say about this declaration in the UN is very serious, because even if the UN doesn't have much power, I worked in the UN and really nothing happened other than is previously agreed upon. This creates a shift. So we create reality with language, and this is this definition that entangles the state with the people. I think it is the kind of legalizing a totalitarian way of thinking. So it's very dangerous. And I think maybe you can elaborate a little bit more about this entanglement between the state and the people, and how can we separate these two concepts in order to, or elements, in order to create a definition of anti-Semitism that actually refers to the discriminatory way in which people are treated, in a way that is specifically to the Jewish, culture, right? Because it's very difficult because race doesn't exist, right? We have peoples, and we have the language also determines how we think about things, right? So please elaborate. Thank you.
في كمان هون
بإسهاب أكثر عن هذا الموضوع.
definition also كمان بحب أنا
القدس أو إعلان القدس كبديل لهذا also can you tell us more and elaborate more regarding this anti-Semitism about that it's true that the law might not be very liberate, but then the law sometimes is a bending tool in the hands of the authorities. So how can we stop this law from developing, because this might touch our balance and our capacity and resistance capacity. Dr. Raif, if you can answer. Muted. فقط
Actually, before 2 years, I initiated together with other friends, Gilbert Ashkar, Nadia Abul Haj, and Rashid Khalidi. We did initiate a statement signed by many Arab and Palestinian intellectuals, of course, condemning anti-Semitism. At the same time, condemning the abuses of the fight of anti-Semitism, or under the disguise of fighting anti-Semitism. Actually, it is meant to be fighting a pro-Palestinian movement. So I would refer you to that declaration, which was published in The Guardian in December or November before 2 years. Now, I agree with you. The issue is that Zionism is taking over, and the political imagination that associate Jews with Zionism and Zionism with the state of Israel and the state of Israel as Jewish state. So there's triple reductions here. And while one should take a firm and clear stand against any discrimination against the Jews, but there is a long distance from here up to saying that Israel not only have the right to exist, it has the right to exist as Jewish state. Not to mention that there is nothing in the declaration that says clearly where is Israel at the first place? What is the Israel that if one denies the right of its existence would become anti-Semitic? So whenever one wants to make a definition, the definition must be historical. To write a definition now as if we are at the end of 19th century, at the Dreyfus days, we're not at Dreyfus days now, these days. The Jews are not a minority. The Jews are majority now. The Jews are not stateless. The Jews have not only a state, they have a state and a half, a state of Israel, and they are occupying the West Bank and Gaza. They are not the victims anymore, they are the victimizer. They are not the helpless, they are the one with guns. So to speak about anti-Semitism, one should be historical, not ahistorical, and should take the power relation into account, and to continue to treat the Jews now as if they are stateless refugees while they are preventing statehood from Palestinians and making them refugees is just speaking sort of a kind of metaphysical language that wants to monopolize the idea of victimhood, as if you once are victim, you are victim forever. And this is something we as Palestinian, we should resist very vehemently, and to distinguish between Judaism and Zionism, and even between Zionism and Jewish state. At one point, there were a few Zionists, not many, but there still were Zionists who thought that they can live as a group in Palestine, even as a minority, as a cultural minority, or in binational state. And here comes the definition that collapses all those distinctions and fetishizes the state. And I agree with you that we should keep these distinctions. In many ways, the definition actually adopts Zionism. It just makes Zionism the natural representative of the Jewish people all over the world. And that's why one of the voices that came against such a definition, as has been always the case, is many Jewish around the world who think that such a definition do to them harm, doesn't help actually. Now to the other point, and this is open questions because I write about these things very often, and I feel that many kind of very dismissive. Oh, what the UN can do? Oh, the UN can do a lot, not definitely to allow Palestinians to regain their rights, but to lose their rights, to give up their rights. Can you imagine the situation in 1947 without the UN resolution, partition resolution? The partition resolution gave the Israelis in 1947, in 1948, international support to do what they did. So we shouldn't confuse between two things, between the fact that the UN has been and probably will continue to be unable to guarantee the Palestinians their rights, and the fact that the UN, when it supports Israel, because Israel can combine the symbolic and ethical and moral symbolic capital of the UN with economic and military power. And then we are in in bad situations. So I hope that covers something of your question, some parts of your question. Now, as to the GDA, I must say that at one point, I was one of the initiators of a document, of a counter document to the IRA, which ended up being the GDA. I didn't sign the GDA. It was clear at one point that I will not be able to sign the GDA because the GDA speaks the language of the North. I called it, it's a wide document. It's a document for liberal, and for me, liberal is not a curse, like many love to do that. But for liberal, white, European, and liberal Jews, from within the discussion about anti-Semitism, how to approach it in a way that it doesn't stand in opposition to the Palestinian demands for equality, justice, freedom, and self-determination. I myself, I'm not positioned in that position. I'm a Palestinian and I'm asking for these rights. So there is a matter of positionality, there is a matter of language, and there's a matter of terminology that as a Palestinian, I couldn't sign it. Now, do I think that it was a good document politically a good document? I think it has many positive aspects to it. The most important is that any demand for Palestinian rights that are recognized, including the right of return, is not anti-Semitic. The BDS is not anti-Semitic. A binational state in Palestine is not anti-Semitic. So I thought that the fact that these three are stated is important. This is not the definition that the Palestinian can live with, but it's good that it's there. Why it's good that it's there? Because it shows that there is no consensus whatsoever on the definition of anti-Semitism. It's debated, it's conflicted, and that's a good reason why probably when someone in American university is being accused of being anti-Semitic according to the IRA, one can put on the table that there are other definitions by prominent scholars who think that there are other definitions. So the fact that there is a controversy over the definition of the IRA, I think, is important. Now, as Reem, to your last comment, I absolutely agree with you. Though the IRA is not really a law, it's a soft law, but it's a soft law that creates, as I said, very harsh realities, in fact. And there is good reason to fight against it, of course. And it's not that we think that law doesn't matter. No, law matters. Law creates reality. Words, discourse, language creates reality, shapes the imagination. And in this case, it's clearly becoming a tool of really oppressing all pro-Palestinian voices. So I'm in total agreement with you on this point. Okay, so I'll stop here.
شكرا دكتور رائف.
We continue our session, whether you want to leave or to stay with us, depending on your circumstances. Thank you. We would start the next intervention. Camila would be replacing Emilio due to some construction works at Emilio's window. So we had to do this kind of change. Camila wants to speak about a new constitution or nothing, the revolutionary experiment in Chile. Camila is a critical legal theorist, historian, and journalist from Chile, writing on the relation between inequality, corruption, and the law, and how to institutionally empower common people to resist oppression from the powerful few. She is also a fellow at the University of Cambridge, an author, of Semitic corruption, constitutional ideas for an anti-oligarchic republic. Camilla, please.
Camilla?
Thank you. Thank you for that introduction. Before starting, I wanted to pick up one last thing that Ref said before, which is the BDS issue here. That is, I think I want to actually have 5 minutes of my own presentation to alert you of this. A couple of years ago, there was a project of law in Congress in the US that was against BDS. And what it did, because it couldn't go kind of censor it, they defunded it. So they said that any corporation that engage in boycotting Israel in any way would not receive public funding. So this is another way of censorship. So this is something that maybe take into account in how, you know, the structures of oppression use the tools in order to adapt and to gain power in other manners that seem legal, but they're not, right? I'm going to talk about Chile. I'm going to go through the history, the brief history from October 2019 to today, to understand this plebeian rebellion, this rebellion from below, the rebellion of the common people. Of course, when I wrote the abstract and I was thinking about it, the presentation, the plebiscite was not there yet, the result. And the plebiscite yielded a rejection of the draft constitution. And there were many things involved, but I want to kind of give you an idea of that movement and the dangers and challenges that opens, okay? So I brought some slides just for you to see a part of the how the protest looked like. I have been documenting this for a while. So basically, I label it in the title a revolution, thinking that maybe the people would accept the new constitution and really the revolution would be materialized. However, it only ended in rebellion or in a failed kind of Thermidorian, a very conservative process that was crafted from above. But still, there is a popular resurgence now after the rejection. So first, Chile has been always a poster child for neoliberalism. It has always had like great numbers. Just before the rebellion, the uprising, you look at the numbers and it's really great. It looks great. There's low unemployment. We are the 18th most free economy of the world, which means we are open and have trade agreements with everyone. There's no protection for national industry. We are one of the cleanest, supposedly, countries in the world, number 24. And there's low inflation, and we have a very high per capita income. Now it's almost $20,000 a year, which is pretty great. And we're part of the European and rich countries club. However, there's another B side to this, and this is inequality. We are the 20th most unequal country in the world. We allocate the richest 1% basically own a third of the national wealth, and that is increasing. Actually, with the pandemic, it was doubled what they had some of the families. If you see that the distribution, even if we have in that $17,000 a year in terms of per capita income, really the minimum wage is $447. So this is, and you see that the difference with how much the president earns or a politician. We have the best paid politicians almost in the world relative to what is the national income, okay, and the wages. So we have been living in a socioeconomic apartheid in a way. If you are born and you are part of a neighborhood that is working class, you will live 18 years in average less than a person that is born in a high income neighborhood. This is how brutal it is. There's all kinds of different things that that makes all the systems private, and everybody has the public system, which is defunded and precarious. So there is a world for the rich and a world for the poor. So this brought us to the popular uprising of October 18th, 2019, which was enabled by a small increase in the subway fare in Santiago, in the capital, and that prompted a massive civil disobedience campaign by high school students. So high school students called for evade the fare, not pay as another way to struggle against the system. And this prompted two schools, one of historically a very good kind of public schools from males and other females, girls and boys, and then other schools started doing the same. And this was being copied like a snowballing effect of repertoires of contention. And this was part of, I would say, a long repertoire of a cycle of contention in which that started in 2011, also with high school students protesting against the education system based on the voucher, in which basically we have to buy half of the education in order to have a decent one. The public one is really not good, and the other is just subsidized, and you have to pay for yourself. And there's not a lot of monitoring. Then healthcare protests also because of the high prices of drugs. Here you see an old woman with all her medication here hanging, right? Pensions are basically misery pensions below the minimum wage. 80% of our seniors are in basically poverty. There is a lot of gender violence, so also a lot of feminist protests. There are 900 encampments in Chile where people live without electricity or running water. So therefore, there is a movement for housing for people that do not have home, for the transport, for the increased pollution, and to have an idea of the production matrix of Chile, we are a mining country. So therefore, there's a lot of residues coming from mining, and because mining is done by transnational corporations with little limitation, then there are zones in Chile which are deemed as sacrifice zones. The zones of sacrifice. So basically, this community needs to just live in pollution and have cancer in order for us to have like the revenue that comes from taxes from these corporations that extract the minerals. And also we have indigenous racism, basically racism against indigenous peoples. So all these demands and all these movements that have been protesting since 2011 crystallized in the petition for a new constitution. People understood that it was not about individual demands at the end, it was about the structure, and that the constitution written by General Pinochet and his advisors basically during the dictatorship needed to go and needed to be changed for a new constitution. It was a very kind of a sensible thing to be asking. And this basically, there was a movement since the beginning, so since 1980, when the Pinochet constitution was approved in a plebiscite, supposedly free in a dictatorship, there was a movement that began asking for a constituent assembly, an assembly of the people to write a new constitution that would be pro-people in a way, in favor of the people, and limiting the power of oligarchy. This prompted many protests, and in a few days, with the subway evasions and all the other protests that started to again flare up, the government lost control of the movement, and there were stations that were closed. The students just opened them by force, and there were no way that people could stop them. So there were multiple metro stations on a Friday, October 18th, that were set ablaze at the same time in multiple places in the city. Okay, and this has never been investigated. Until today, we don't know who burned the subway stations. And if you think about the subway stations, they're not made out of wood, but of metal. So therefore, it's not easy to burn them. You need special knowledge of where to set the fire. And that fire needs to be set where the electrical central system is. And you need special acid to dissolve, all the metal around it that is protecting it. So this was a concerted effort in a way. And the government immediately after this happened called the military for the first time in democracy to go and impose order and repress its own population. There was a state of exception, and this is a picture of the entrance of Baquedano station, which is in the Dignity Square, which was renamed Dignity Square after it was closed and basically abandoned. And repression started immediately at the beginning, and viral videos when people were filming this. And there were 5 different reports of human rights violation against the government in Chile, and the use of what I call repertoires of repression, of a certain modes of dealing with protest and of torturing people and abusing people that you could see in many places in Chile being used in a systematic fashion. So here there's a mural, and here I'll show you a lot of murals in the city. And they said, aquí torturan, here they torture. And this was a way of, and this was in the Baquedano station that I showed you, where it was closed, and it was a torture place. And basically the cops would bring you and then torture you there and then release you. So it was a torture center basically for a few days. There was, and here some images of, the protests always, some was peaceful, some was more violent. However, what really marked the repression was the mutilation of eyes from the people. Basically, more than 400 people lost one or both eyes. With the use of pellet guns. And this is something that, at least as I've been told, there is a collaboration between the Israeli police and the Colombian police and the French police in terms of this repertoires of repression. This were used also to shots on the knee, for example. There's something that is also have been used in the Palestinian and Israeli border, basically, and also the mutilation of eyes. And there was huge protest. Nothing was done about the human rights violations. So we're back at a dictatorship kind of style repression, and with all eyes on us, basically, with many reports, officials, and nothing happened and nothing came out of it. A lot of imagery came from this. So here we see President Piñera sitting with the ghost of General Pinochet and the Bernardo Higgins, who is the father of the patria, of Chile, who is the conqueror basically, and who pacified the indigenous populations and made a unitary Chile. So very kind of like this history is all connected, and this is how people started seeing the president. This is a famous mural, hasta que haya justicia, until there is justice. Knowing that there may be non-justice, because Pinochet actually died in his home in a very, because he was senile supposedly, and never saw a prison cell. So this is a mural in Población El Castillo, who was a población, which is a kind of a working class neighborhood that was very militant during the dictatorship. And they basically wanted the president to be imprisoned and dead, basically. This was part of the rhetoric. The same neighborhood would vote against the draft constitution that would allow for the dismantling of the system. So that's how crazy the result was. So out of this tumult, basically, for a month of repression and videos and really people died, deaths and mutilation, the president was saved. We were thinking about the president would leave in a helicopter kind of a situation. We were wrong, where the political class came to save him. And here we see all of the right-wing coalition plus some of the old concertación people who are the neoliberal left, right? The left that sold itself to the system, plus the now current president, Gabriel Boric, there sitting on the front. And this pact allowed for a constituent process and the election of a convention. However, the convention was had a 2/3 supermajority for every article, which meant that the conservative forces would have veto power. There was no political participation in the binding political participation that would force or allow for meaningful participation of the people in the constituent process. So a process that started from below with the students, in which the students could not participate because they are minors, they cannot vote, right? So that process was co-opted by the political class and channeled through the electoral process, which is a process that is already rigged and controlled by them. So the people immediately alienated, and people kept protesting. People didn't care about this pact. The politicians thought that the people would basically clap and be happy that a constituent process was open. They didn't care. They just kept protesting and kept meeting as nothing happened. So we had local heroes. We call it La Primera Línea, the first line of defense. And is basically there's a repertoire of contention every Friday after the first uprising, commemorating the first uprising in Plaza Dignidad and every square in Chile, where people would meet and confront the police. There was decolonizing practices, as we saw also in the UK lately, with the getting rid of old statues of colonizer in the Mapuche region, in the region of the indigenous peoples. There were what I was telling you, the first line of defense, these plebeian superheroes, basically. We had this guy that always was there in the square. The people called them a pareman, the stop man, because basically he just grabbed one of the signs and he was this shield, and he would go and confront the police, protecting the other people that was protesting. We had a guy dressed as a Spider-Man, Pikachu. We have all these kind of popular characters, people just going and making a performance of the resistance against the forces of order. Also, we had intervention of the public space. So in the middle of Plaza Dignidad, this epicenter of the rebellion, there's this statue of a general, colonizer, right? So we could not get rid of it. People wanted to get rid of it, but they couldn't. So they intervened it to basically undermine its power. And in the left, we had the feminist movement also intervening the statue. We also had another repertoire of contention, cycling protests to evade arrest. There was a new law that actually was approved by the current president when he was in Congress that penalizes any person that participates in a protest that blocks the street. So it's called the anti-barricade law. So if you're in a protest, a mass protest, and the traffic is stopped, the police can legitimately arrest you, and you're risking 3 years in jail. Okay, so the cycling protests that are protests in movement became very popular, and masses of cyclists just went in the streets, and they had like a route, and they would go and protest and would basically paralyze the traffic in another manner. Very clever. We have, of course, the murals. We had a lot of coming back of Salvador Allende, the president that nationalized copper and that was ousted by the Pinochet dictatorship. This is another one that says they're not terrorists nor criminals. They're conscious students, trying to, all the murals are always trying to give this message. There was also a huge movement for gender equality. We had the Las Tesis, which was this collective that created this song, this performance, El violador eres tú, the rapist is you, which brought the state and the judges and all the patriarchal society into this performance. So this is a death to the patriarchy. We had a lot of lesbian and gay imagery in general. Advocating for gender equality and for acceptance. This was something that was all across the cities. And also we had repertoires of repression. There's a cop attacking a human rights defender. So they would go with their orange shirts and they would actually become the target. So media and human rights defenders, observers, were targeted by police and were repressed even more than the protesters. There were other repertoires of repression once people were arrested, from sexual abuse, from forced nakedness, basically, many things that were very degrading, and they were copied in many places. Then in terms of the repertoires of contention that after the first year that we were in pandemic, which was very difficult for the movement, there were commemorations of the uprising. And here you see a little bit of what was done. Here you see in the one on the left, the flag of the Mapuche people, who are actually they are deemed the Palestinians of the South because they live also in surrounded by a colonial settler state and have been putting up a resistance since the Spaniards came to Chile, basically. And they are treated as de facto second-class citizens. And the Mapuche imagery and cosmology and the flag was at the center of this rebellion, even though they're only 9% or less than of the population. And then we had the presidential campaign in between all this process. So the convention was elected, it was working, and we had in the middle presidential campaign in 2021 at the end, a few months ago, 6 months ago. And basically we had two choices. One was the son of a neo-Nazi, of a Nazi soldier that emigrated to Chile and collaborated with the Pinochet dictatorship. So we had like the actual like devil incarnate on one side. And on the other, we had this student leader who sold himself as a social democrat, who basically wanted to take the flag of Antifa. He defined himself as the anti-fascist, but however, he embraced a kind of a center-left neoliberalism, a strange combination of ideologies that are very pragmatic in a way, but very systemic. And people celebrated him as kind of like the new messiah in this moment. However, he was immediately, his approval rating went down because what happened was that the people voted for against the fascists, but not for him. So basically, immediately that 1.5 million votes that he got, they were basically gone into the opposition. So the draft that was voted in the 4th of September of this year, all the media landscape was full of fake news and misinformation. From the government, from the politicians, from all the media is in hands of the right-wing oligarchy. So basically there was a mounted campaign against it, and there was no information coming from the government. There was no letter sent. The people didn't know about the process. The only information came from TV, and TV was co-opted by these forces. Because there was lack of popular participation from the beginning, the kind of like the extreme or paramilitary left, or not paramilitary, para-parliamentary or extra-parliamentary left immediately denounced the process and saw it as a treason. And the Boric government the approval rating was in the lower 30s. So if we combine all these factors, and in addition, people were forced to vote against a heavy fine. So people were forced to vote, so they voted reject. And the same kind of militant neighborhoods that had gone out in protest against the system voted against replacing the Pinochet constitution with a better, more progressive constitution that was still, faulty in many ways, but still better. And today we have, and with this I end, we have a new process supposedly being negotiated right now, again by the political class. which has like 3% approval across the board, that basically the people elected to office have no legitimacy, and they are negotiating a process that will be led more likely by experts and will exclude popular participation even more. So we are in a heavy crisis, which brings a lot of challenges, but also possibilities, because when things break, some new things come out of it. Thank you.
Thank you, Camilla. We'll on with Emilio. Emilio. about النشاط القانوني الفلسطيني بين التحرر والرغبة في إقامة.
So this is Emilio's paper. This is about Palestinian legal activism between liberation and the desire for statehood.
Constitution. Something went on. إيميليو محامي فلسطيني دكتور في العلوم السياسية وتخصص في الشؤون الدستورية.
Lawyer and he's visiting a colleague in York University. Emilio, the floor is yours, please.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you, Rim. Can you hear me? Yeah. Okay. I want to thank first for the invitation. I'm glad to be here. I'm glad also to meet Camila Vergara, to see friends and other people that I met in Palestine. I want to also apologize because I will be presenting a text that I had already presented in Palestine, but I have a good reason for that, and I think it's a very important topic that sometimes is somehow forgotten, and I think is of absolute urgency today. Since I was invited to speak in a conference about shrinking spaces and resilience strategies, I wanted to present again this text that advanced the idea, rather, I would say, provocative idea, and for some even irritating, the idea of international law and international human rights law being used today to actually not to expand the spaces of freedom for Palestinians, but rather to shrink them, to limit them, and to act as a sort of disciplinary tool. More and more, we see that the debate and the discourse on Palestine is more and more frequently framed in the language of law, human rights, and international law more generally. And the presentation that I wanted to do somehow revisits what I would call the Palestinian turn to law as a main strategy for emancipation. So contemporary Palestinian politics is marked, I would say, by paradoxical dynamics. While we observe an entrenchment of the colonial regime, division within the national movement, territorial and institutional fragmentation, and heightened authoritarianism, we also witness a growing reliance on international law, the language of the rule of law, good governance, and human rights. The paradox, I would say, lies in the fact that despite law playing a central role in furthering these colonial dynamics, Palestinian and pro-Palestinian groups increasingly translate their political claims into legal language as their primary site for the pursuit of an elusive political emancipation, producing what Foucault would call a discursive explosion in the juridical field in relation to Palestine. Everyone, or almost everyone today, when it speaks about Palestine, does it within the frame of human rights, international law, and law more generally. Now, this turn to law has, not surprisingly, I suppose, prompted a sort of further legalization of Palestinian politics. From the perspective of the Palestinian Authority, for example, a non-sovereign entity, but nevertheless highly legalistic in its action, this shift is extremely clear. And it is best reflected now by the PA's almost obsessive use of international law to frame Palestinian political claims. But also, ordinary citizens are turning to law and increasingly contest what they perceive as violation of their rights before PA and international judicial mechanisms, often, of course, with meager results. Similar dynamics occur within Palestinian and pro-Palestinian social movements, which persistently frame their political agenda within the language of law, particularly human rights and international law. Well, I would say, or allow me to say, that it's at least strange to see Palestinians who have witnessed their dispossession and colonization organized, reified, and embodied in law, and their own authority using law to impose an additional regime of political subjugation. It is strange, I say, to see Palestinians placing so much faith in legality to achieve political emancipation. The problem is not so much the use of law per se, you see, which can obviously have an emancipatory potential. But what is worrying is that Palestinians seem to have uncritically embraced law as their main, and sometimes it seems their only strategy. One would think that when confronted with the impossibility of achieving their political objectives by other means, Palestinian and pro-Palestinian groups have experienced a sort of psychoanalytical displacement of desire, if you allow me to say, moving from real emancipation to the uncertain promises of law. Their discourse, as Judith Butler, paraphrasing Lacan, would say, constantly analogizes the lost object, in this case political emancipation, with the present object, the promises of law, and construct false certainties on the basis of partial similarities. Later I would explain, is not the same statehood than emancipation, right? The persistent resort to international humanitarian law in Palestinian and pro-Palestinian discourse is an excellent illustration of how seemingly liberatory mechanisms can also become technologies of their own domination. This legal corpus, international humanitarian law, entails a horizon which limits the debate on Palestine to the 1967 borders and the end of the occupation of the West Bank and Gaza. But it doesn't say anything about 48, the Nakba, the refugees, etc. It not only tends to exclude Palestinian refugees, but also casts out from the debate any reference to the Nakba and its continuous impact, imposing a solution of two states that, given the form of negotiations on Palestinian statehood, would certainly rearticulate the current political subjugation of Palestinians. And this formula imposes this problematic option even before we have had a proper debate about what a fair solution may look like, not only for Israelis, but for Palestinians, all Palestinians as well. These dynamics put into effect particular and very legalistic conceptions of freedom, equality, and emancipation, when what we need is to argue about the powers that need to be negotiated or defeated to produce a real emancipatory order for Palestinians. Some important works, critical actually, of this turn to law or highlighting its limits and dangers have been published by Palestinians and non-Palestinian scholars. They analyze, for example, the instrumentalization of the legal discourse and a certain political cynicism that it can produce, like Laurie Allen, for example. Or they also reveal how the Israeli juridical field reduces Palestinian political claims to legal technicalities, such as the nature of elements of proof and evidentiary burdens, excluding the political debate of the Nakba and its refugees, like in the work of Samira Ismail. Also, this work exposed the appropriation of the language of international law and human rights by conservative actors and state powers to shield their actions from legal accountability and reproduce structures of subjugation, like the work of Noura Erekat shows, or others that highlight the whitewashing, pinkwashing of egregious Israeli policies against Palestinians by resorting to a rhetorical affirmation of minority rights, gays' rights, for example, like in the work of Catherine Franke. Or even more disturbing, these studies unveil Israeli settlers' work in framing their own situation as a question of law and human rights, like in the work of Nicola Perugini, for instance. However, I would say that for a complete diagnosis of the complexities, tensions, and contradictions that the turn to law implies, and beyond cynicism, beyond instrumentalization or appropriation, critical legal scholarship on Palestine needs to pay careful attention to the very logic that the turn to law imposes and its impact on Palestinian struggle for emancipation. We need to undertake a sort of, I would say, critique of legal reason, asking what law itself does, its language, its criteria, its assumptions, its structures, its practices, to our political claims. What does law do to our political claims? Some literature in other fields, like Indigenous First Nation studies in Canada, labor organizations, LGBT, and African American rights movements, identify some of the main problems present in legal logic and these movements' own shift to law. They show, for example, how, for instance, legal logic narrows or channels a movement's demands into terms that are recognizable to a liberal regime of rights while transforming their political substance and normative aspirations, or how the juridical field turns the affected communities into rights holders, increasingly concerned with legal technicalities and thereby flattening or erasing an analysis of relations of law and power and structures of oppression. These critiques also show how law generates an attachment by relevant communities members to a kind of injury recognized by right-based claims and the identities associated to them, wittingly or unwittingly, reinforcing essentialized identity politics, or how law and the logic of law privileges precedent, causation, individualized harm, and other legal values over critiques of power structures, imposing a binary logic of winners and losers on the more radical, democratic, and richer debates and approach to socio-legal change embraced by movement actors outside of the legal context. This literature also explains how legal practices and structures facilitate the rise of elites, such as lawyers like us and other experts, to the position of leaders, who then shape the movement's goals in place of the expertise and goals of grassroots movements leaders. And finally, this literature, critical literature, also shows how legal language and legal discourse favors an uncritical assessment of the kind of victories that law can deliver, thereby obscuring the processes by which strategies of redress can become technologies of domination. Given this summary diagnosis, I think there is a space to ask, should Palestinians uncritically embrace legalism as their only or their main strategy for emancipation? By which logic does our claim for the liberation of human subjects becomes a discursive strategy for legal recognition? How does legality constrain our political aspirations and make us want what it promises but cannot deliver? What is the nature of the relationship between desire and law? How do law and its productive and legitimizing powers bring us to desire with such a force things like rights, institutions, regulation, statuses that are not only different from our original political claims, but that very often subvert them or are the exactly opposite of them? Take the example of Palestinian statehood. The obsessive insistence of the PA on being recognized as a state, and the astonishing number of ordinary people and political movements who fervently support this strategy, which is, again, eminently legalistic without necessarily changing anything meaningful on the ground. The obsessive desire for a statehood evidently has led Palestinians, the Palestinian leadership particularly, not only to be ready to accept something different from what they fought for, in this case, to accept pseudo-statehood rather than emancipation. But the problem is also that the state that they are negotiating when they were negotiating seems to be the exact opposite of what they originally wanted. Indeed, the Palestinian national movement was created and sustained by refugees, and it always defined its struggle as a battle not for statehood per se, but for the liberation of Palestine and the return of its people to their land. Now, everything in the Israeli-Palestinian negotiations when they were taking place indicates that a potential Palestinian state will be built, if ever, on the very renunciation of the right of return. Well, this is exactly the opposite of what Palestinians were fighting for. So my conclusion is simple. I think we urgently need to seriously engage with the Palestinian movement's turn to law and its potential consequences for political emancipation. But my point should not be misunderstood. I tend to agree with Spivak when she says that rights are something that we cannot not want. Effectively, between a political order with rights and one without, my choice is clear. I prefer one with rights. So therefore, the aim of this analysis of my presentation is not to advocate for an abandonment of law and rights, but rather I propose to continue a necessary debate on the paradoxes, ambiguities, and traps that law offers, so that Palestinian strategies of emancipation effectively do not become technologies of domination. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Emilio. Thank you very much. I will open, can you hear me, everybody? I will open the floor for discussion if there are any questions. Camila, please.
I have a fascinating, thank you for this presentation. So I have a comment, maybe it would be useful to look at a critical legal theory. So I have been writing a little bit about this, but basically following Lenin and Rosa Luxemburg too, they saw the law as the regulation of exploitation. So even labor law, which was supposed to be the most emancipatory law of all, is just the regulation of the labor conditions and even the regulation of our own life. You know, at what time do you enter, how many hours do you work, the bathroom breaks, everything is connected, right? So then the challenge, and of course, Marx also argues that the rights are Spivak, you know, is they're a minimum. You cannot not want them, you need them. However, that is only legal, formal emancipation, not material emancipation. And I think this is kind of like the distinction between formal and material that we need to kind of inquire about, that we need to actually look. I don't know if you have been looking into this, but this idea of the right holders that we are transformed into right holders also has a special relation, and I think this is also connected to kind of the when rights become liberal rights with Locke and property, the connection with territory, because we come back again to the idea of the state and territory and how are you a right holder and what is your right holder of, right? What rights do you have to territory? What is your relation with territory? And if we think about the Western tradition, it's always about dominion. It's always about being the owner, the sovereignty, to be able to move people around, to, you know, control the borders. All of this is part of the enclosure, you know, of the private property. However, the indigenous populations, the first, and you, I would like to hear a little bit more. So they have a different relation with territory. They're not property owners. They don't conceive rights as, you know, Western people do. So is there in the Palestinian tradition maybe another relation between the community and the territory that we could explore or that would make sense in this struggle? Thank you.
شكرا. إيميليو، أنا عندي سؤال أو يعني ملاحظة سؤال. It's basically the moment the Palestinians accepted the idea that
تقبل فيها الفلسطينيون وجود.
they had to accept the idea that there is a law. I mean, there is a change. I mean, the moment they accepted Oslo and its conditions of building a state, at this moment, we also accepted that the tool, the discourse, everything is going to be law. Legality became very important at that moment. So, is your question mainly about how the Palestinian, because I mean, either you can say all the project, the whole project of building a state is something we have to criticize throughout as an outcome, as a process and everything, or we're saying that how the Palestinian use the law is problematic. We know, for example, that legal discourses cannot frame the political question in the way we want it to frame. I mean, with the moment we frame the Palestine question legally, we definitely lose a lot of its elements, a lot of all what we wanted from this political question. So are you basically criticizing the state because state and law are one? Or are you actually criticizing the way the PA and the Palestinian use the legal instrument and legality? And here you're differentiating, you're saying that we're using it instrumentally rather than strategically, or you're saying the whole framing of it? Because in the past, there were uses of legal discourse. It was used differently. It was, there was a thinking of trying to change the law itself. So there were movements that were trying to influence a lot of that discourse and pushing for different understanding of it. So this is my question and remark. There is also a question here from do you accept, from Sambahour, do you accept that the Palestinian National Liberation Movement have two separate goals, full statehood and full return, both being unconnected and may be achieved? I can't see the word after that. I don't know why.
Asynchronously.
Okay. Okay. The screen is cut in. Okay, تفضل.
Thank you, Camila, Riemann, and Sam. Hi, Sam.
في كمان Emilio, can I? There is another question in Arabic. Can I read it so you can
Please.
answer? Sorry for that. Hanada is asking. المجتمع للقانون والعدالة وبين القانون الذي يطبقه. She's asking, are you not actually mixing between the society and its need for justice and law, or and between the law as the colonial power put it, whether in Palestine or in Chile? Basically mixing between the society needs law and justice and between the law as a product of colonial powers.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Well, regarding Camila's question or comments, of course, I mean, my work is based on the literature that I'm sure you had in mind when you were making your comments, critical legal studies. I have been, I mean, this question about what is the relationship between desire and law, which became very pertinent to me, even though it may sound far-fetched to many. But, you know, these questions of how law makes us desire things like statuses and rewards or titles or etc. Right? So what I'm saying is not new, right? I was saying all these critiques, and I made a list of critiques that literature from other movements do about law, right? The only thing that I'm trying to do is to consider these critiques and these thoughts and this work for the Palestinian case, right? How is that effectively in the Palestinian case, law has somehow served to reproduce structures of subjugation and domination? Of course, there is no doubt regarding the Israeli colonial regime, right? I mean, they have been systematically using law. It's a very legalistic occupation. It's not exceptional at all. Pinochet's dictatorship in Chile was also fundamentally legalistic, right? So there is no doubt that law can be used for purposes of subjugation and domination rather than emancipation. And that this is done not only by the instrumentalization of the law. Of course, instrumentalization is an important concept and idea. But I suggest that we need to go further of instrumentalization and appropriation, which is the classical critique. But I'm talking about what happens to our political claims when we people fighting for emancipation, not for repression and dictatorship, but for emancipation, use law, what happens to our political claims? And effectively what we can observe is that our political claims are either transformed or even sometimes subverted, like in the example of Palestinian statehood that I was given, right? The turn to law imposed to a statehood imposed on Palestinians a condition that they were never willing to accept, the renunciation of the right of return. This is why I say that because Palestinians understand today that the only possibility of an Israeli, US, European recognition of a Palestinian state will pass by the renunciation of the right of return. This is the main condition. Of course, there are other territorial conditions and security conditions, but the main one is the renunciation to the right of return. Well, in my opinion, this is the total subversion of the original political aspirations of the Palestinian national movement. So given that law and the language of right has these dangers, what are the alternatives? Do we renounce to them? No, I'm not suggesting to do that. What I'm suggesting to do is to have a critical perspective on the tool that we are using in order to, among other tools, right, in order to emancipate ourselves, right? So what are the alternatives? Well, in political theory, there have been historical alternatives, right? I mean, for example, Hannah Arendt would say, look, if what mankind wants is real emancipation, well, what they need to renounce is the idea of sovereignty, which is the idea of the state, basically, right? Or Foucault, when he says, well, if we want to really emancipate ourselves, we don't need to only get rid of the state, but we need to get rid also of all the mechanisms of power linked to the state. What does it mean? Maybe one could conceptualize it by saying that maybe what we need are conceptions of non-disciplinary rights. And effectively, where do we find these non-disciplinary rights? Well, indigenous movements are a good example of that, precisely because of what Camila was saying. There are different ways of conceiving rights and law and their relationship to nature and etc. Right? So I would say that non-disciplinary examples of non-disciplinary rights are, for example, rights of nature, the rights of environment, etc. All things that have been recognized by progressive constitutions, and the Chilean one, the proposal of the Chilean one was one example of this. So this is what I would say now. Now, why we need to be critical of the term and to acquire this critical perspective? Because look at what happened to indigenous movements. There is a big iconic example in the US of an indigenous community called Mashpee people. They went to court claiming that their land had been alienated, sold, without the legal requirements, because there was a law from the 19th century in the US that forbids the selling of indigenous land without the approval of the federal government. The indigenous community was claiming that this land was sold out without the authorization of the federal government, and therefore they wanted back. The court says to them, no problem. If this land was yours and it was sold out without the authorization of the federal government, then you will get it back. But the first thing that you need to do is to prove to the court that you are a tribe, because the law that you are invoking protects tribal land. So the community asked the court, how can we prove that we are a tribe? Well, very easily, because the Supreme Court of the US has already defined what a tribe is. And when you see at the concept of a tribe of the US Supreme Court, it says that it's an homogeneous group of people within a certain community and permanently occupying a exclusive territory and who have a leadership. Well, when you think about this definition, well, this is a definition of a nation state. This is exactly the definition of a nation state, an homogeneous group of people living exclusively in a particular territory and having a government. So the Mashpi people, in order to emancipate and to see their rights recognized, had to perform in court an identity that was not theirs. They had to prove their nature as a tribe according to the criteria of the US Supreme Court. So at the end, they end up performing an identity. In order to emancipate themselves or to see their rights recognized, they are forced to perform an identity that is a false identity. So this is an example of legal subversion of political objectives. Now, I will try to go faster. So what I'm criticizing, Grim, well, yes, I criticize the move for a state that is obsessive, like the move that the PA is advancing. I criticize the fact that the PA is willing to renounce to anything, territory, refugees, whatever it is, in order to be recognized as a state. And that, as I was explaining, is also a sort of subversion of the original political claims of the Palestinian national movement. And finally, there was someone who said, it's strange because, you know, before some decades ago, and maybe it was Camila, we were critical of the law. Right? Marxist tradition showed us and taught us that actually law was one of mechanisms of power, and conservative and repressive power. And what I don't understand is how did we forget this critique and embrace law in a so uncritical way, as a main and very often the only strategy, when some years ago we were perfectly aware of the subjugating character of legal systems. How did we forget this critique? Why did we forget this critique? And how liberal and neoliberal discourse works towards this end, right? Naturalizing, fetishizing the law as if law was, you know, as if law was a divine gift that we cannot, right? This is what we see when people say, well, but this is a law. Well, what do you mean when you say this is a law? I mean, the law can be an unfair law, an unjust law, and therefore the authority that you give, the ideological authority that you give to law doesn't have any grounds, right? This is what I'm criticizing. No, now, I'm not calling for the abandonment of law or rights, but I'm just saying we should be aware of the traps, of the tricks, of the unfulfilled and unfulfillable promises of law, and orient our political activism, of course, towards law and other venues of political action, but strategically and aware of law being also a primary tool of domination by conservative powers.
Thank you, Emilio. I have a question for Camila. I've seen that you used neoliberalism with the left. I've recently have noticed that there is a lot of references as well that the neoliberalism is not only a right-wing phenomena, that the left has also contributed to that, and Chile being the factory, it seems, for both the left-wing neoliberalism as well. Could you please elaborate on that a bit, if it's possible, particularly with the Chilean experience? Thank you.
Thank you. I want to briefly refer also to the relation between justice and law, because in addition to kind of making sure that, or acknowledging the force that law has in terms of modeling our desires and how we even perceive ourselves, we need to think about who makes the law. This is something that we as moderns have completely forgotten, that law was actually made by the people before in some regimes that we called free, and that today we have outsourced to the politicians. So if the politicians made it in the correct procedure, you know, in the Senate and the majority, and therefore law is good. And that is something that is complete nonsense. If our parliaments or our leaderships are compromised and are conservative, they will make law that would benefit themselves or their cause and not the people. And also with the relation and justice is something that is also not something that delivered by law. Justice was something that was delivered by trials by the people in the past, and the popular juries were the cornerstone of democracy. And today we have forgotten about that too. So as a way out of this conundrum of if law can be emancipatory, we need to bring back into the equation who makes the law, the agent that makes the law, and understand that the people themselves need to be involved in questioning law that is oppressive and creating law that could be emancipatory. And therefore, there's no emancipation but self-emancipation. So we need to become legislators in a way. And for that, we need to organize from the ground up. So create institutions and not just allow for the leadership, whatever, if there's good or bad, to decide and pass law which will become oppressive for the majority, because they're not the majority, they're the leadership, right? And in terms of neoliberalism from the left, the problem is that neoliberalism has become the only game in town. There's no austerity politics and fiscal responsibility and all this, you know, concepts, economic growth. Everything is done for improving investment. Okay, so what happened in Chile was a very peculiar thing. When the dictator was losing, you know, there was going to be a plebiscite to oust him in 1988. He called the leaders of the opposition, which had been half in hiding, and you know, others who were protesting at the end of the dictatorship. The dictator called them, the same as the pact, the social pact, the pact for peace and the new constitution. The political class got together, and Pinochet basically said that the only way that he was going to leave power in peace, step down without war, basically, was that the politicians would never question the constitution. And they could reform it, yes, but they could not call a constituent assembly and basically do a new constitution, which was the obvious thing to do. So that meant that neoliberalism, which was codified in the constitution, entrenched, could not be removed in a way, very difficult. You need supermajorities in Congress to do that, became the new status quo, basically. The way things were done was naturalized. And also the rules that were put in place to protect the system, for example, an electoral system that benefited the minority coalition. So the right-wing coalition said, well, we're always going to be in the minority, so this is going to benefit us. However, the government of the Concertación de Partidos por la Democracia, so the Concertación of all the parties that were pro-democracy, so against Pinochet, they were center-left. Some of them was the Socialist Party, of which, you know, Presidente Allende was part of this party, you know. So we had the party of the president that was ousted by Pinochet in this new coalition, center-left coalition, actually reproducing the system, reforming it to make it work better, right? Not dismantling it, and then actively profiting from it. So, for example, we have the first socialist president, because we have two governments of social democrats, the Christian Democrats. And then we had the first socialist president, President Lagos. He basically tackled, for example, the inequality in transportation and quality of life by creating, by leasing new urban highways. So instead of creating public transportation for the many in order to dismantle the traffic because it's all single cars, right? Is less efficient. He gave to transnational corporations the contracts for creating urban highways, which are very expensive, and therefore only the rich can use. And you have an apartheid in terms of the experience of the city itself, right? So this is the socialist president doing this. And of course, the constitution also controlled in a way change. You can only play in the field that is already predetermined, right? So another example of this, that it came from the right-wing government of President Piñera during the pandemic. He just didn't want to give any bonus for the people, any money. People were struggling, okay? So the opposition, the new left, you know, the people that are now in power, they were saying, this is, you know, we need to do something. We need to, you know, help the people. And the constitution was so conservative that gave all the power to legislate and to create, to create law that is attached to money. So anything that that needs money to be materialized needs to be initiated by the president. So Congress cannot initiate it. They cannot touch the budget. Okay, so the only thing that they concocted in order to create a pools of money for the people was to allow for them to take out a 10% withdrawal of their own pension funds. So this idea of the neoliberal idea of that we save for ourselves, we individuals save for our pensions, even if their meager pensions are ours, we take from our own money in order to from our retirement to help ourselves now, right? And that was the push from the new left coalition. So they need to work with the system, and says, as Emilio is saying, you know, law and the structures really constrain the field. So these people that self-identify as left, now they are promoting the same system. And we have today the kind of the new left president actually going to sign the transnational agreement that will basically produce more extractivism and would not allow Chile to change its economic model. So basically restraining Chile for the future, and that they're calling it development, right? And that we need new investment. So therefore we're gonna sell our country and our natural resources in order for have economic growth, for him to have a better approval rating or something. So therefore it is the system that constrains, and the left doesn't exist anymore. The left within the system is not left, because a left that is in favor of transnational agreements with, you know, big countries that will come and extract everything from your country, that is not left. Someone that is willing basically to continue with the system of private ownership of all the basic resources, that is not left. Someone that is left try to dismantle the neoliberal structure. So we're having this weird, when I say called, is a compound that doesn't exist, the neoliberal left. Either you are left or you are neoliberal, but you cannot be both. But they self-identify because they have, you know, the socialist label. So it's all about, you know, the narrative and how we understand ourselves.
Shukran. Thank you. Emilio, do you want to say something? We can't hear you, Emilio.
Yeah. Now, I wanted to address. I saw a comment from Sambahur in the chat, and he says, "This is when I was saying, you know, the negotiations on statehood will lead us to, or the Palestinian leadership to renounce to the return, to the right of return." And some says this is not true. Many countries have recognized Palestine and never conditioned this recognition to the renunciation of the right of return, which is true. But I would ask two things. What is the state that these countries have recognized? Because this is something that, according to the international consensus of today, will be and needs to be negotiated with Israel, and we know the conditions that Israel is imposing is basically labeling the colonial situation as a state, right, without any meaningful change on the ground. So the problem, Sam, is that what state are they recognizing, and how much are they legitimizing the diktats of the Israeli colonial regime? Because they will recognize whatever state Israelis and Palestinians negotiate, and we know what kind of state they will negotiate. So the second point here is that in the fight, the obsessive fight for a statehood first, Palestinians have somehow turned upside down history, because when you review history, countries have first liberated themselves, and then they have established their states in a sovereign way. So think about anyone, right? The colonization in Africa, Middle East, Latin America, most of them fought wars to liberate themselves, to emancipate themselves, and then they declare a statehood. The other way around, which is the one that Palestinians are advancing, well, basically compromises the very idea of the state that you are trying to create, because you are negotiating it in a non-sovereign status, and therefore with no leverage, and basically accepting all the conditions of the colonizer. So in this, the problem that I have is not with the statehood, is with the historical order of our struggle. And I think we should be struggling in a popular struggle for emancipation and liberation, and then Palestinians in a sovereign way to decide whether they want to organize themselves as a state, 2 states, 3 states, I don't know. So this is my problem, Sam. Now, one last example, maybe even clearer than the ones that I gave before, of how law and international law in the case of Palestinians have operated as disciplinary tools rather than emancipatory tools. Look at what is the consensus on the international legal corpus that today we cite when we refer to Palestinians. Well, we refer to Resolution 242, Resolution 338, and the international humanitarian law, basically the Geneva Conventions. Well, all these legal corpus, when you look at it together, first represent Palestinians only as victims, because international humanitarian law is the law of the victim, right? When in reality, Palestinians have, like any other people, agency, and they are not only victims, right? Second, Resolution 242 and 338, well, basically they consolidate the colonial design, the appropriation of all the lands from 48, plus the territorial swaps that they are trying to impose, and they are leaving Palestinians in maybe 20 or 19% of the mandate Palestine. Well, this is the consolidation of the colonial regime. So, and finally, we have Palestinians, we have been forced to renounce to violence as a legitimate way to fight oppression, recognized under international law to all peoples of the world. Look at Ukraine today. They are not terrorists, they are heroes, right? And they are resisting a foreign power, but Palestinians no. Palestinians can only be a victim. And this is why only international humanitarian law is allowed to them to be used as a frame. But why are not we using, for example, the annexed protocols of the Geneva Convention that were signed during 60s and 70s, and that were basically advanced by the colonizing countries, and these protocols effectively recognize the right of resistance by any means, recognize struggles for liberation as international conflicts, and do not represent Palestinians or any other colonized people only as victims, but agents of their own destiny. So this legal language of the annexed protocols of the Geneva Convention are forbidden for Palestinians, are forbidden. The only law, international law we can refer to, unless we want to be called terrorists, is international humanitarian law, Resolution 242, Resolution 338. Well, these resolutions basically frame the consolidation of the Israeli colonial regime. Thank you.
شكرا إيميليو. بدي أنهي وأختم الجلسة.
Thank you, Emilio. I would like to thank and conclude here this session. I'd like to thank all speakers and participants with us. I would like to mention that tomorrow, the fourth session will start at 10:45 Ramallah time. So there will be time for discussion. The Muwatin is not included in this session. It will be with the unions. So I hope that you all can make it. It's about the paradoxes of public sphere interaction. I'd like to thank you, Emilio and Camila, for your very beneficial speeches, and we will end the session right now. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Rim. Thank you, Camila.
Yeah, so she's asking if you were able